There's been a lot of discussion regarding the new exam content outline for the PMP certification. This is for exams beginning in December 2019. Since I incorporated many of these changes into my PMP training material shortly after the release of the 6th edition, I will try and provide my interpretation of these changes. But before I jump into the detail, let me introduce myself. My background is in IT, but I've worked as a program manager, product manager, project manager, and as a business analyst for many years, incorporating many of the various techniques that I have learned. This includes studying not just the standards and practice guides from PMI and other organizations, but also working with individuals whom I consider to be thought leaders in the area. I currently have my program certification as well as a PMP, in addition to the Agile and Business Analysis certifications from PMI. I have taught all of the courses within the Masters of Project Management program from DeVry Keller University, which is part of a GAC-approved program from PMI. Even though I do not actually hold all the certifications in the related areas, I do have extensive experience and understanding that I can bring to these areas. I have been both a frequent reviewer and SME for many PMI standards and practice guides. The new content outline for the PMP exam was published in June 2019. It is based on the 6th edition, even though that standard came out a few years earlier. Many of the changes in the 6th edition, especially regarding basic terminology, were incorporated in the CAPM exam and exam content outline. But the actual changes for the PMP exam, based on the 6th edition, have not been reflected in the exam content until this time. The new examination content outline will take effect for all PMP exams beginning in December 2019. The exam is based on role delineation studies or job task analysis, which PMI performs periodically. As stated in the new PMP exam content outline, the result of these studies utilize knowledge and task-driven guidelines to assess the practitioner's competence and help determine the levels of salience, criticality, and frequency of each of the knowledge, tasks, and skills that have been identified as being required to perform the industry-wide standard for the role of a project manager. In addition to the role delineation studies, a global practice analysis market research study was done to identify trends in the profession which previously had been unaddressed in the PMP exam. These were used to ensure that the validity and relevance of the PMP stays current with those areas. This also makes sure that the exam appropriately measures and evaluates specific knowledge and skills that are required for a project manager to function effectively. It also measures all the elements of the project management profession using situational questions. Many of the questions on the new PMP exam have been rewritten and extensively reviewed by qualified PMP certification holders to make sure that they are all situational in nature and they have at least 2 academic references. We have been told for a long time that the PMP exam was not based solely on the PMBOK guide, but now it's very obvious that additional resources support the exam questions. The team also ensured the exam questions have been mapped against the PMP examination content outline and that an appropriate number of questions are in place for each of those items. Even though the Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, commonly referred to as the PMBOK Guide, is recognized as the global standard for project management profession, there are a number of other PMI standards and practice guides that will be included in this exam. 2 of the additional standards are the Risk Management Standard and the Organizational Project Management Standard, or OPM. In addition to the standards, many of the practice guides that have been created to help explain in more detail some of the concepts that are referred to in the PMBOK guide. These practice guides are usually created prior to being converted into a full standard. These practice guides include the governance of portfolio, programs, and projects, managing change in organizations, implementing organizational project management, the Agile Practice Guide, which was distributed along with the 6th edition of the PMBOK Guide. In the discipline of business analysis, the Business Analysis for Practitioner Practice Guide, along with a Requirements Management Practice Guide, were published prior to the new Business Analysis Standard, providing substantial additional information. Even though the program standard may not be a reference for the PMP exam, there are some areas in the new program standard and the new benefit realization practice guide that pertain directly to a few tasks on the new exam content outline. Regardless, every organization and project team must determine what works best for any given project. So all of these references are meant to be able to help a project manager make a better decision as to what concepts are most appropriate for each individual project effort. The exam domains have been modified to be more in alignment with other PMI certifications. In the people domain, the role of the project manager has transitioned from command and control to that of a leader. With this change, it's not surprising that a large percentage of the exam is now focused on the people aspects of the project. This includes not just the core team, but also the stakeholders who are critical resources on every project. They help ensure the project team understands and successfully delivers the vision and expectations. The process domain relates to what is identified in other standards as a life cycle domain. And except for including more references to multiple approaches, there are not as many new concepts in this domain. The business environment was reflected in the talent triangle around 2015 and was expanded in the first 3 chapters of the 6th edition. There are also PMI practice guides and standards that have been developed and updated recently to provide additional understanding for many of these areas. Many of us who provide project management training recommend these other publications for additional understanding in these areas. The new exam content outline format has been modified to help with the understanding and interpretation of the areas that will be covered on the exam. This includes 3 domains, which are high-level knowledge areas that are essential to the practice of project management. There are tasks for each domain. These are the underlying responsibilities of the project manager for each domain. Each task includes enablers. These are examples that illustrate the work associated with each task to help demonstrate what the task encompasses. Just as is stated repeatedly in the PMBOK guide, when examples are listed, these enablers include but are not limited to those listed. The content of the certification exam is recognizing that project managers work in a variety of project environments and utilize very different approaches for their projects today. The PMP certification exam will incorporate these approaches across the entire value delivery spectrum, as stated in the exam content outline. The examination will represent an almost equal split between predictive project management approaches, referred to as waterfall approaches, and those agile or hybrid approaches that have become more prevalent today. All of these approaches will be found throughout all 3 of the domain areas and not isolated to just a particular domain or task. Even though the business environment domain is listed as number 3, it's normally the one that we need to address at the beginning of a project. The business environment domain includes 4 tasks that are very critical for project managers to understand while delivering a project result within an organization. These are only briefly mentioned in the first sections of the PMBOK guide, since there are specific practice guides that have been developed for each of these areas. It is highly recommended that those practice guides be reviewed, at least at the summary level, prior to sitting for the exam. Projects exist and operate within environments that may have either a positive or negative influence on the project. Factors which impact the organization and prompt the authorization of projects include the alignment with organizational strategies to achieve strategic goals. This is part of Organizational Project Management, or OPM, and is addressed in the Implementing Organizational Project Management Practice Guide. These strategies are documented in business documents, including the business case and the benefit management plan. Additional information on the benefit management plan is contained in the Benefit Realization Practice Guide. Projects are created to drive change and enable business value. These two aspects introduce additional complexity and ambiguity. These areas are addressed in the Managing Change in the Organization Practice Guide and the Business Analysis for Practitioners Practice Guide. Projects are constrained by the structure and governance frameworks within the organization. Project managers must understand their responsibility, accountability, and authority within organizational systems, general management elements, organizational structures, and the governance framework. Additional information regarding these systems and frameworks are included in the Governance of Portfolio, Program, and Projects Practice Guide. The first task in the business environment domain is to plan and manage project compliance. This includes making sure we understand and confirm the actual compliance requirements which may impact our project. This includes classifying these into various categories to address in the most appropriate manner. We must be able to identify potential threats or risks that might prevent us from meeting these compliance requirements. That includes using methods to support compliance and analyze the consequence of non-compliance. This may require a different approach to address these compliance needs, as well as additional stakeholders and activities to ensure compliance, including additional risks and legal involvement. It is important to continue to measure how the compliance requirements are being met. This may be done using a version of a traceability matrix to ensure that all compliance requirements are delivered at the end of the project. Task 2 refers to evaluating and delivering project benefits and value. These enablers expand upon the benefit management plan, which is one of the business documents used in project initiating and planning. Even though by definition a program, not a project, provides benefits, it is important to understand the value of the result that the project delivers. This is one of the core concepts of all adaptive approaches. This requires taking a value-driven approach, making sure value is delivered as the result of the project. Once those benefits are delivered, we must make sure that they are transitioned to and incorporated in the receiving organization. In both the business analysis and program standards, this becomes part of the transition and sustainment management planning activities. These additional plans include how, when, and to whom are we going to transition the result. Also, how we make sure that the result is sustained, including the criteria for monitoring and evaluating the success and expectation of the result. The enablers include making sure we understand what benefits were identified when the project was approved. We must document the ownership and responsibility for the ongoing realization of those benefits. We often need to evaluate multiple delivery options to demonstrate this value. This is often done through the use of an incremental or iterative approach so that portions of value can be delivered in a shorter time frame. This approach also helps those stakeholders who will be receiving or impacted by those benefits understand the value and the progress being made. We are obviously living in an environment that's continually changing, and projects must be more adaptable. The longer it takes to deliver, the greater the chance that the result will no longer meet the needs as originally identified. This ever-changing environment has increased the adoption of a more adaptive approach to project management. Task 3 looks at the impact on the scope of these external business environment changes, including regulations, technology, geopolitical, and market influences. These need to be evaluated and addressed on a continual basis. When changes happen, they must be assessed, prioritized, and various options must be identified, including the impact on the scope or backlog. Notice here the reference to two terms regarding requirements and items which pertain to scope. Scope is the traditional term that refers to what is to be included in the project. Backlog is an adaptive term that includes requirements not necessarily included yet in the scope until after multiple planning sessions have been held, which continually reprioritize these requirements before becoming part of the final project. By delaying details for future requirements, we can reduce the amount of rework or changes to previously completed work. This is a core concept of Lean, reducing all unnecessary work that does not add value, and delaying final requirements and implementation decisions until closer to delivery. Task number 4 refers to the need to support the change in the organization resulting from the project. The best way to explain organizational change is to use a phrase a colleague of mine once said. We identify the current as-is environment to determine the future to-be environment, but we need to make sure that after we finish, the organization doesn't return to the as-was. Change management, not change control, refers to the impact on the receiving organization of our results and whether they will be accepted and assimilated. Those organizational changes were used to authorize and justify the project. This includes our need to understand and assess the current organizational environment and evaluate the impact of the results on the project. Project managers and team members must recognize and determine actions needed to enable the effective incorporation of the change into the receiving organization. This task is directly related to tasks in the people domain on the exam. Not only does the culture of the organization affect the people and their ability to understand and accept the changes, but also the engagement by the project team with key organizational stakeholders. The next domain is the people domain. The people domain include tasks that are discussed in different areas within the 6th edition, including the new Section 3 on the role of the project manager. This section includes the transition of the role of a project manager to more of a leader. Some agile methods do not feel a project management role is needed, especially when looked at as a command and control role, rather than following servant leadership concepts. Servant leadership is explored in detail in the new Agile standard from PMI. Task 1 in the people domain has to do with managing conflict. We need to identify the source of the perceived conflict, the stage of the conflict, and analyze why the conflict is taking place. After that analysis and evaluation, we need to recommend or reconcile utilizing appropriate conflict resolution solutions. This is a typical scenario we see in the exam questions. But if these disagreements are not managed, they can escalate into a conflict situation. Allowing empowered team members to have their individual points of view considered often leads to better results. Many teams incorporate the concept of 6 thinking hats to further encourage thinking from different points of view. As long as team members continue to listen to each other and can discuss various options, there's really not a conflict situation, but rather a joint effort to identify alternative solutions. It is only when team members or individuals no longer listen to each other that disagreements escalate into various stages of conflict. Task 2 refers to the leadership role of a project manager. Most of these concepts have been included in the develop team and manage team processes within the project resource management knowledge area. Part of leadership includes establishing a clear vision and mission of the project purpose, a part of the Agile process of chartering the project and continuing to map the results that are delivered to that vision. A project team is made up of many diverse individuals. Understanding the differences in culture and generational sensitivity and diversity are important. Interpersonal skills are now part of the project manager competencies. This leadership role also includes various leadership styles and motivational theories that should be used as the situation requires. The rest of these items will be addressed on the following slides. Some key leadership styles include directing, persuading, participating, facilitative, delegating, coaching, and supportive. Probably the most important of these is servant leadership. This is the leadership style upon which most of the adaptive methods are based and is explained as it applies to projects within the new Agile standard from PMI. Motivational theories help project managers inspire, motivate, and influence team members and stakeholders. These include Maslow's hierarchy of need, Hertzberg's hygiene motivation theory, McGregor's theory X and theory Y, and McClelland's three-stage theory on motivation. Some of the newer theories pertain to a more adaptive and situational type of motivation. Hershey-Blanchard's addresses changes required based on the maturity of the organization and the individuals. Situational leadership utilizes an understanding of the current situation to determine the motivation and leadership styles that would be most appropriate at any point in time. In addition to understanding how to lead and motivate the team, a project manager needs to understand all stakeholders and team members and how their impact, influence, and interest on the project can affect the project. In addition to understanding how to lead and motivate the team, a project manager needs to understand all stakeholders and team members and their impact, influence, and interest on the project. From that understanding, a determination on how to communicate and engage with them at the most appropriate time and in the most appropriate method can be made. Multiple techniques help with the analysis, including various grids and the salience model. Task 3 has to do with supporting the performance of the team. The performance of the team effort needs to deliver results and achieve identified key performance indicators or KPIs. Rather than always thinking of how we as project managers can encourage improvements to current work efforts, we need to recognize when there are positive results and appreciate the effort of the team members who are able to achieve these results. One process that utilizes work performance reports is Manage Team. These reports help the project manager evaluate the work reports and determine if changes are needed to improve performance. Additional feedback is needed to continuously improve all aspects of the team performance. This includes retrospectives or continuous capture of lessons learned. In adaptive approaches, continuous improvement includes frequent review and adjustments to processes, products, and people. The combination of all three are needed to make sure that the team is performing at the highest level. Part of this requires recognizing and supporting areas where various team members can grow and develop. Task 4 is also one of the core concepts of adaptive methods. All members of an Agile team are empowered to make suggestions and individually identify areas where improvements may be possible. The entire adaptive team is accountable for the results delivered. It is not the project manager alone who determines the project scope, activities, and schedule, but rather the combined effort of the team and product owner customer. Together they prioritize the identified requirements based on the value provided to the business. The entire team determines and commits to what they will complete within a given time frame. In order to do this, the entire team must be organized and the work based on the strength of individual self-organizing team members working together. It's important to support the team to complete their commitments. The project manager must not be the only decision maker, but other team members can make decisions either individually or using group decision-making techniques. Task 5 addresses the area of training and making sure that not only our team members but also stakeholders are adequately trained. This includes understanding what competencies and elements of training are needed based on the project development approach, but also the environment, the organization, and the industry in which the project will be developed. This area is addressed in the Project Manager Competency Development Framework from PMI. This task is also included in the Develop Team process within the Project Resource Management knowledge area. There may be an assumption that the team members who have been assigned to the project were assigned based on their previous knowledge of the area in which the project will be developed. It would be most desirable to have the most skilled team members and knowledgeable stakeholders as part of the team, but some team members may have been assigned because they have availability rather than experience and the knowledge required. Regardless of the assignment, it's important to determine where additional training might be required to broaden their knowledge and which options might be available to meet those needs. Many Agile approaches define team members as being generalist rather than specialist. The new Agile standard from PMI refers to T-shaped rather than I-shaped individuals. These team members can support multiple project activities rather than only being skilled or knowledgeable in a limited area. Both time and other resources must be allocated for training efforts, and measurement of the outcomes of that training must be established. Task 6 addresses building a team and is currently addressed in the PMBOK guide as part of the development team process. This expands the team concept to include also key stakeholders. During the planning of a project, it's important to understand the skill and knowledge requirements for all project resources. The evaluation of the skills of the actual resources assigned may determine that additional skills are needed. These can be provided by additional training, mentoring, coaching, or working together to share knowledge. When teams work closely together, knowledge and understanding of all aspects of the project are easily transferred. Tuckman's ladder of team development reminds us that change happens as new members are added. In order to develop and maintain a high-performing team, most adaptive approaches recommend full-time team members and product owner participation. This eliminates the stages of storming and norming each time a new team member is added. One of the key roles of a servant leader is to make sure that the team can complete their activities by having the leader remove any impediments, obstacles, or blockers for the team. These are often identified through daily meetings where not only is current activity discussed by all team members, but any obstacles are identified. These must be prioritized as to the impact that they are having on the ability of the team to complete their current work. Because many of the obstacles will exist in other projects as well, these are often escalated to a PMO or group of project managers to help arrive at a common solution. Just as issues that are identified on traditional projects need to be continually reassessed, so do any impediments, obstacles, and blockers, and ensure that the situation is being corrected. Task 8 refers to project agreements and the role of the project manager in the negotiation and ensuring that the objectives of the agreement are met. The actual role of the project manager in this area is dependent on the organization and responsibility for agreements. The role and authority of the project manager in this area will have an impact on the actual negotiation strategy that will be used. Regardless whether directly involved in the negotiations for the final agreement. The project manager must provide the requirements, objectives, and prioritization for individual agreements. They may participate to ensure that the objectives and requirements are satisfied. It should be noted that the 6th edition provides a very broad definition of an agreement, from a legal contract to emails and even including verbal agreements. As part of the stakeholder analysis activity, it is important to understand the desired engagement level for the project. This includes balancing the project objectives and requirements with the needs and expectations of the stakeholders. These expectations should be clearly defined so each stakeholder understands their role and involvement in accomplishing the project objectives. Task 10 refers to the importance of all stakeholders and team members having a shared understanding and vision of the project objectives and activities. Through effective communication and feedback, potential misunderstandings can be discovered and addressed in a timely manner. Where there is a misunderstanding, it is important to determine the root cause of the misunderstanding as well as having a clear understanding of how to solve the situation. This often includes involving several parties to reach a consensus on a solution and then ensuring that everyone supports that agreement. Task 11 addresses virtual team engagement and support requirements. When a project includes virtual team members, it's important to understand the needs of those members. These can include understanding the working environment, culture, location, and other global aspects. Various alternatives must be investigated to ensure the appropriate engagement is available for these virtual team members. Various alternatives must be investigated to ensure the appropriate engagement is in place to support these virtual team members. This is especially important in the area of communication. When full co-location of team members is not possible, tooling is often used to facilitate this virtual environment. These various options should be implemented and evaluated for effectiveness throughout the project. Task 12 is another core principle of Agile methods, where the team defines and establishes ground rules. These ground rules are identified and continually reviewed and adapted by the entire team. Through the team environment that is established, the entire team is also responsible for enforcing the rules that they set. These rules can include areas that pertain to the organizational environment within which the project is being conducted, as well as the approach and practices being used. In addition to recognizing training needs for stakeholders and team members, there's often a need to provide additional individual mentoring on the approach being used and the expectations of involvement to relevant stakeholders. These mentoring opportunities should be recognized, time allocated for these activities, and support provided. Task 14 refers to how emotional intelligence can be applied to team performance. Part of emotional intelligence includes the understanding of individual personalities. These indicators relate to individual behaviors. By analyzing and understanding the various personality indicators, it allows adjustments to be made to how the emotional needs of key project stakeholders can be met. The remaining process domain refers to most of the tasks which were included in the previous exam content outline, but rather than dividing them by the process groups, they are now grouped by areas defined by knowledge requirements. This domain represents 50% of the exam and includes 17 tasks. This area includes different terminology and techniques utilized by the various approaches, referring to both predictive and adaptive terminology. Task number 1 addresses the ability to execute with urgency in order to deliver business value. Much of this content is covered both in the business analysis guides and the new Agile standard, emphasizing delivery of business value. By using various delivery approaches, value can be delivered in a shorter time frame, focusing on smaller portions of an overall solution. As a project manager, we need to assess various opportunities where this value can be delivered by the project. This can be accomplished using a term I often use by the usage of chunks, or delivering a smaller increment in a shorter period of time. By continually prioritizing and using methods such as Moscow, we make sure that the most important aspects or requirements are delivered first. The minimal viable product is determined to deliver a base product providing value to the customer and yet allowing continued enhancement by adding additional features and functions in future increments. It's been long recognized that more than 80% of a project manager's time is spent on communicating with stakeholders, team members, and management at all levels in the organization. It's important to analyze the communication needs of all the stakeholders and then determine the best way to communicate with them. This includes the methods and kinds of channels we can use. It also helps determine the frequency and level of detail for individual stakeholders. The communication plan identifies these factors to ensure that the most current project information is communicated effectively. In addition to communicating and distributing information, it's important to make sure that our communications are well understood and that we receive feedback at any point in time. Task number 3 refers to assessing and managing risks. The initial assessment of the current business environment helps determine the organizational risk appetite, tolerance, and thresholds that will impact the project. It's important to determine various risk management options or responses given the environment, especially as regards those risks that will require escalation, being riskier than the project can handle. It also identifies how to handle risk with a low enough probability and impact to just be able to be accepted. The risk management area has been very thoroughly defined and documented in both the PMBOK guide as well as the standard for risk management. The steps for identifying, assessing, and prioritizing has been changed slightly when using an adaptive approach, but a risk burn down chart is used to manage risk on a continual basis for adaptive projects. Task 4 refers to the knowledge area added in the 5th edition as the importance of engaging with stakeholders was escalated. This is especially important in a changing environment where stakeholders provide the understanding of those changes and the impact on the project. In addition to just identifying stakeholders, it's important to analyze those stakeholders in terms of their interest, influence, and impact to more appropriately engage with them. It's important also to group various stakeholders into categories to help focus the engagement needs for various groups. Also important to understand the appropriate engagement level for these various stakeholders. This includes development and continually monitoring the strategy to ensure that the current engagement level is what is needed. We utilize techniques such as stakeholder maps and an engagement assessment matrix to help with the determination of effective engagement. Task 5 addresses one of the major constraints for projects. It's important to understand the vision and scope of the project and what kind of resources are going to be needed to deliver that scope. Key information can often be derived by reviewing historical information from past projects as well as lessons learned. Anticipation of future budget challenges need to be considered, whether they relate to variations of actuals from what was originally estimated or new change requests. Regardless of the source of the change, it's important to work with the established governance process to ensure continued alignment with organizational objectives. Budget and resources are not just addressed in the cost knowledge area, but also refer to both team and physical resources in the new control resource process. This new process addresses the planning and management of the usage and consumptions of various resources that are needed, especially those that must be acquired from the outside. The Earned Value Management Practice Guide has just been updated and includes additional information applicable to projects today. I encourage you to look at that updated practice guide. Task 6 is on planning and managing the project schedule, and probably where the Agile approaches have made the greatest impact on the way a project is scheduled and delivered. It's still important to understand what needs to be done, whether those are requirements for a work package or are the tasks to deliver the user stories. Estimation of the length of time required for either of these depends on how much previous knowledge is available, the approach being used, time constraints, and various available estimating tools. With predictive projects, more historical data and benchmarks are available, whereas with most adaptive approaches, the schedule is given and the velocity or amount of work that the Agile team can accomplish within that time frame determines the schedule activities. Regardless of the method used, both rolling wave and progressive elaboration techniques are utilized for developing the project schedule. The way that progress is monitored and reported is different based on the methodology and approach used, but both should be identified in the schedule planning process. This also includes when and how changes to a schedule will be identified, assessed, and approved. When resources are being shared with other projects, it is important to coordinate and communicate status and timing of activities. This is especially important when one activity may slip or need to be rescheduled, impacting a resource identified to perform that activity. Agile approaches, by encouraging full-time teams, with each team performing independently, eliminate the need to coordinate with other projects or operations. Task 7 deals with the aspect of quality and is an area that is highly dependent on the project itself and the quality requirements for those deliverables and results. It's very critical to make sure that required quality requirements are defined and identified how they will be met. One way to continuously improve the quality of both the process and the product is by using retrospectives or lessons learned meetings. These should be done continually throughout the entire project. It's also important to continually review the quality of the deliverables, not just at the very end of the project, but as the work is being done. This ensures that the result is still in alignment with the expectation and specifications of each deliverable. Task number 8 has to do with planning and managing scope. This is one of the major areas that is handled very differently between a traditional project and an adaptive approach. In a traditional project, the scope of the project was identified, and then that determined how long it was going to take to complete and how much it was going to cost. In most Agile projects, the schedule and budget to deliver have been set, whether using flow-based or time-boxed approaches. The scope, also known as the product backlog, is then determined and prioritized as the project progresses to ensure that we provide the most important value first. Breaking down the scope into smaller components is referred to differently depending on the approach used. In traditional approaches, this is done by decomposing a WBS into work packages and then activities. Using adaptive approaches, features or functions are defined by large user stories, sometimes referred to as epics, which are then disaggregated into individual user stories and eventually into tasks. There are several practice guides that address these various aspects of the scope, including a newly released WBS practice guide, as well as the Business Analysis Requirements Management Practice Guide and the new Agile Practice Guide. Regardless of how the specific scope components are identified, it's important to continually monitor the work to make sure that what was approved is delivered, but also to make sure that the result is validated by the stakeholders and meets their acceptance criteria. Task 9 integrates all the various planning activities into a single task. It's important to understand the individual plans for each knowledge area to determine what is needed, what the approach will be used, and how the results will be monitored. These individual subsidiary plans are then compared and assessed for dependencies and gaps and are consolidated along with a few other items, to become part of the overall project management plan. The development of the project management plan helps determine how we plan on executing and managing the project, and then allows us a way to compare and evaluate what is actually happening, why there are differences, and what needs to be done to address the variance. The plan also helps continue to achieve the identified value for the business. This integrated plan is used to analyze work performance data and compare to what was planned to make informed decisions regarding if or when changes to the plan are needed. The three main baselines are key components in the project management plan and provide the critical information requirements to be met as project deliverables are produced. It is important to remember that changes to those baselines can only be changed through approved change control processes, while the other subsidiary plans should be assessed and updated continually as needed. Task number 10 addresses changes to the project and the management of those changes. This includes two different areas of change control. One has to do with a change within the business environment and how this particular project is going to handle those organizational changes as they occur. The other has to do with how change requests handle preventative actions, corrective actions, or defect repairs. Most organizations have a change control process as part of their methodology, including identifying a change on a change request form, logging the request on the change log, assigning it to someone to analyze the impact of the requested change, and then either approving or rejecting the request. The process needs to be validated to ensure that it's appropriate for this particular project. This also includes determining who has the authority to approve a change request and when the formal process is required. One of the misconceptions in agile or adaptive approaches is that there is no need for change control since change is expected and embraced. In reality, changes are still managed and controlled, but applied to a much shorter time frame. When a release or an iteration starts, a determination is made as to what will be done. In a time-boxed approach, this means that the requirements are frozen for the length of that time box, with no changes accepted during that time. All changes are held and are analyzed, and determination is made whether they should be incorporated in the next time box. That allows the project to adapt to changes more easily, but doesn't disrupt the work that's being done within a particular time frame. There is a project configuration management practice standard that I highly recommend, as well as understanding the agile approach to change as discussed in the new practice guide. Task 11 has to do with the area of procurement. This is an area that seems to change with every new addition. Overall, the processes remain pretty standard within most industries. It is important to understand how procurement is done within the organization in which the project is being performed. Part of this includes determining the procurement strategy and processes for this project within the organizational procedures. As project resource requirements and needs are identified, those requirements that will be met using external resources must be identified and communicated. Understanding how the procurement process is done within the organization and how long it will take to acquire those resources is a critical part of developing the project schedule. Once supplies or resources are obtained from outside of our project through some form of agreement, project managers must manage both suppliers and the agreements or contracts themselves. Those resources acquired externally need to be incorporated into the delivery solution. This includes not only when those resources will be made available, what activities they will be working on, as well as alternatives, especially in the case when there might be a delay or a need for alternative resources to be utilized. Task 12 refers to managing project artifacts and refers to the new process, Manage Project Knowledge. There is an extensive list of potential artifacts listed in the 6th edition and is highly dependent on the approach and methodology for the project. Requirements for artifacts must be considered to identify what is needed, when it will be created, updated, and used, where will it be captured and maintained, and who is responsible. This area is part of a larger discipline of knowledge management. Artifacts in adaptive methods are defined as barely sufficient, since they rely on more face-to-face discussion rather than providing documents for an external group to review. Regardless of the method used, it is important that all project information be kept up to date using version control and is always accessible to stakeholders and team members as needed. Since it is not only important to capture but also provide access to various artifacts, the effectiveness of the management of these must be continually reviewed and assessed. Assessment of the project needs, complexity, and magnitude often determine that a predictive rather than an adaptive approach is more appropriate. This is also impacted by resource constraints, including financial constraints or financing options and availability of funds, internal or external to the organization. A determination is needed on what is the best approach to use, whether a lot of upfront planning is done and then executed as a whole, as done in a predictive approach, or where requirements are not as well understood and possibly require chunking into smaller pieces. Regardless, almost every project is going to require a mixture of adaptive and predictive approaches. There'll be certain things that must be done in a certain order, and other areas requiring a little bit more flexibility. These refer to a hybrid approach, and probably 90% of our projects fit those situations. A project manager must be knowledgeable of the various approaches, understand what the needs of the project are, and recommend the best approach for a particular project effort. There are some practices that have been identified in the adaptive approaches which should become standard practices in all our project efforts. These include periodically looking at what we've done through the capture of lessons learned, often through a retrospective activity. This includes not only what was done, but how it might be changed and immediately implementing those changes to see if we can improve the actual performance. The second area has to do with stakeholder engagement. Regardless of the approach, it's critical that the stakeholders have a key role in the project. We must understand their requirements, the appropriate communications needed, and when and how to engage with them effectively. These aspects continually change as the project proceeds. We need to be constantly aware when modifications are needed. The third area has to do with continually addressing risk. This includes understanding potential risk and determining what we should do about them. When a risk occurs, what did we do? Was it what we planned to do? Was the response appropriate and did it work? Anyone should be able to be involved in this risk analysis, and it should be done as often as needed based on the risk score of the overall project itself. The last part has to do with reviews. Rather than waiting to the end of the project to see if we actually met the requirements and expectation, multiple formal and informal reviews are done to make sure that we understand what was being requested, determine if the requirements that are being developed are being done correctly, and assess whether the project is still on track or requires some mid-course adjustments. It is still necessary to get formal acceptance of all deliverables at the end of the project and make sure that all the requirements have been met. Task 14 refers to the actual establishment of the governance structure that will be used for a project. This structure is often determined based on the organizational project management structure that is in place and the business environment in which the project is performed. If the project is within a portfolio and/or a program, then the governance structure must fit within that structure or the organization as a whole. This requires that the structure and membership are defined for the governance board. In addition, roles, responsibilities, and authorities must be established for this organization and the processes for various reviews. This includes determining timing situations, and thresholds which will require escalation to this governance body. The key governance elements that pertain specifically to projects include project success and deliverable acceptance criteria, the approval of the life cycle approach used, the process for any type of reviews depending on the approach, and the process and approval authorization of changes. The Governance Practice Guide focuses on project management as a section of this guide and how governance is defined and carried out to ensure successful results by guiding the activities to create a unique product, service, or result to meet organizational, strategic, and operational goals. I highly recommend that you review this standard, at least the introductory portion, and the portion that pertains specifically to projects. In addition to the governance standard, the information regarding how this works when a project is part of a program is very clearly defined within the current program management standard. Task 15 addresses managing project issues. By definition, a risk that has occurred becomes a project issue. As project managers and team members, it is important to recognize that an event has occurred and we're now faced with an issue. It needs to be identified and assessed as to what action is needed to resolve it as quickly as possible with the least impact on the success of the project. The status of issues need to be communicated, often through the usage of an issue log, to stakeholders. Collaboration with relevant stakeholders facilitate the implementation needed to resolve the issues. Task 16 has to do with making sure that the knowledge that has been acquired for a project is captured and transferred so it can become part of historical information. This is part of the new Manage Project Knowledge process. It is important to understand assigned responsibilities for both knowledge management as well as information management. This also includes establishing an expectation of the working environment, including collaboration, co-location, and communication where both information and knowledge are shared freely among team members and stakeholders. The approach used to transfer this knowledge often has to do with how and when knowledge is captured, how it is managed to keep it up to date, where it is stored so that it can be easily accessed and utilized both now and in the future. The lessons learned register that is developed on an ongoing basis as the project is being conducted will be transferred into a lessons learned repository and become part of the overall organization's process knowledge asset. The final task addresses the planning and managing of the closure of the phase or project and the transitioning of the results to the receiving organization. Closure criteria for the phase or project, as well as any procurement contracts, must be identified and followed according to organizational requirements. This includes the archiving of any historical information that the organization has identified. It's important to understand the activities required for closure, including any additional time required by key team members, as well as the project manager to complete these. These may include collecting the final lessons learned and final retrospectives, and then incorporating them into the organization's lessons learned repository, ensuring all contracts have been successfully completed and closed, all financial obligations have been finalized, and all resources have been reassigned or released. In addition to the administrative portion of closure, it's important to make sure that the organization for which we are providing this result is prepared to receive the result. One of the key plans in program management, but also very applicable to projects, is the transition plan, where we identify what kind of transition activities have to be done and completed before the result can be transitioned. These include documentation, training, and any type of conversion that might be required from an old system or application to a new one. Before transitioning the result, it is important to verify that the receiving organization is ready to accept it. This could be a customer, another organization or business unit, or the production support area who will be providing ongoing support for the delivered result of the project. As you can see, there'll be extensive changes to the exam based on both the current 6th edition of the PMBOK guide as well as other PMI standards and practice guides. You need to download and become familiar with the exam content outline, which is available on pmi.org. The additional standards and practice guides are also available at no cost to PMI members. I feel that most training vendors will not have their materials updated by this new exam date based on their previous responses to exam content outline changes. Changes are made for new editions of the PMBOK guide and not always to the updated exam content outlines. I recommend that you check with your training provider to make sure that the material matches the new exam content outline and that the instructor is knowledgeable of all the areas, approaches, and techniques that are now incorporated to the PMP, including, at a minimum, a PMP and PMI ACP certification. Please feel free to contact us if you have further questions or we might be of help in preparing you for the next exam. Thank you for watching this video, and I wish you good luck in your studies, whether they are for the new exam or just to increase your knowledge of those areas that have been incorporated in the new PMP exam. My contact information is listed here. Please visit our website, facilitatedmethods.com, or contact me through email or through LinkedIn. Thank you and good luck.